So let's continue working on this, and let's continue by having a look at how we can add multiple ingredients, because that's also a case we have. So not just one ingredient, but multiple ingredients at once. This is what gets triggered when we're working on a recipe and we then select the add to shopping list button here to shopping list. So that's this case. And we also have update and delete ingredient to handle. Let's start with add ingredients, because this probably is one of the easier cases to add. And for that, let's go back to the shopping list reducer and let's handle that second case. And for that, of course, we first of all have to go to the shopping list actions and add an appropriate action. So below the constant add ingredient, I'll export another constant, add ingredients, so plural. And here the identifier text is also add ingredients. By the way, in theory, you could of course deviate here. You could have a different string value than constant name, but it is of course a good practice to keep those two in sync, since this makes it easier to match them mentally. Now, this is just the string identifier. An action, however, is an object, as you learned, and therefore we need a second class, which I'll also export. So I'll export another class. Add ingredients sounds like a fitting name, and just as add ingredient, this will implement an action. Now this class here, therefore, also has a read-only type, which here is add ingredients, so the plural form of that. And it will also get a constructor, and that constructor should now not take a single ingredient, but multiple. Still, I'll store the data we get in the payload property. And again, the name is up to you. This doesn't have to be payload, but payload is a typical name, and I would recommend following that convention. And the type here will of course not be a single ingredient, but actually an ingredient array, because we will add multiple ingredients at once. So now we export this class here back in the shopping list reducer. We can now handle that case. So we handle the case that our type is of type shopping list actions add ingredients here. And I'm getting a TypeScript error. Type add ingredients is not comparable to type add ingredient. Do you have any idea what could be causing this? Keep in mind that we tell TypeScript that the action type of the action we're getting in the reducer is shopping list actions add ingredient. Now that was true when we only had this action, but now we have two actions. And we can't tell whether the action that reaches this reducer is actually the add ingredient or the add ingredients action. Now what we could do is we could fall back to the more generic action interface, which we can import from ngrx store. That's the wrong import. Let's use ngrx store. We could do that, but then we get a problem with the payload, because that action interface doesn't know about the payload, so that won't work. So we need a different approach. Of course, we could simply use any, and that would work, but a bit more TypeScript support would be nice. And the solution is to export an additional type here. You can create your own types, so to say, with TypeScript, which you can name shopping list actions or anything like that. And that simply is a combination of all the types you want to include into your shopping list actions. So you create a union of the different action types you want to support in this part of your store. And the union here will consist of add ingredient and, separated by a pipe symbol, add ingredients. This is a TypeScript feature. This simply says the type of shopping list actions is add ingredient or add ingredients. So it's one of these two. And we export our own type to summarize this. This is a pure TypeScript thing, but during development, this will help us. And therefore now we say our action here is actually of type shopping list actions dot shopping list actions. Now, might look strange. The first shopping list actions here is simply the alias I'm using here for our bundled import, and you could name this differently. The dot shopping list actions then refers to this union type I have down there, which kind of combines add ingredient and add ingredients. And now TypeScript knows that our action is either of these two types, and therefore we get no error here. Now back to that case then, where we handle add ingredients. What do we want to do there? We always have to return a new state, so a new object here. And then you learned that I would recommend that you always copy the old state first, so all the properties of the old state. And then here, I again set ingredients equal to a new array where I copy all my old state ingredients, so all the existing ingredient elements in that ingredients array. And then I have to add the ingredients added by my action payload. Now action payload here should not be added like this, because what's my action payload if we add ingredients? Well, it will be an array of ingredients. So if we add it like this, then we add an array to an array, and hence we have a nested array. I want to add the elements of that payload array to the outer array. And therefore here, we should also use the spread operator to pull these elements in action payload out of this array and add them to this ingredients array. So now this reducer is updated. The actions here are updated. Let's now make sure we also use our new action and we dispatch it whenever we do add ingredients from a recipe. Because right now, if I, for example, add my recipes from that big fat burger here, go back to the shopping list, we don't see them here. The reason for that is that I don't get an error, but I do add these ingredients from inside the recipe service, and there I use the shopping list service to add the ingredients. Now that works, but keep in mind that the shopping list service is no longer our source of truth. We're not using the ingredients from the shopping list service anymore, and therefore adding them there doesn't do anything. Instead, here in the recipe service, instead of using the shopping list service, we should dispatch this add ingredients action to use our NGRX store instead. For that, in the constructor, we first of all have to inject our store, which is of type store, and that store still has to be imported from NGRX store, like in all other places of the app as well. And also, as in the other places, we have to be clear about what's inside this store. So you should actually grab the type definition as you have it in the shopping list component, for example. So this object with shopping list and then the nested object with ingredients, and use this in the recipe service here as well when you inject that store. So that TypeScript knows which store that is and what's inside of that store. Even if you don't select anything from it there, still you should provide it like this. Now the store is injected into the recipe service. And now here in add ingredients to shopping list, we're not using the shopping list service anymore, but instead the store where we dispatch a new action. And that new action should come from our shopping list actions file. And for that, again, let's import everything as shopping list actions. That name is up to you. From and now reach out to the shopping list area, to the store file, a store folder, and there to the shopping list actions file. We bundle all exports from that shopping list actions file into that shopping list actions object here. And with that bundled, when we dispatch an action, we use that, but not the bundled exports, but instead the add ingredients class that is set up inside of that shopping list actions file. Well, and this takes an array of ingredients, right? That is the kind of data this action expects. This is the add ingredients action. It expects a payload, which is an ingredient array. And therefore, in the recipe service, we have to forward such an array. Conveniently, we have one here in the ingredients argument. So let's send this with store dispatch. And now with that, if you go back to your application, this is our current shopping list with apple and tomatoes. If I now fetch my data again and I go to the big fat burger and I then execute to shopping list, if we go back to the shopping list, we have the two ingredients from that recipe here as well. And that works because we're now again using our global store. In our shopping list service, we had more than just adding a single ingredient and adding multiple ingredients. We also had functions to update an ingredient, and there we needed the index of the ingredient which we want to update and the new ingredient, and we had delete ingredient. Now let's implement these two features with the help of NGRX as well. For that, we can go back to the shopping list actions because first of all, obviously, we want to add some actions for that, right? We got two new constants that make sense. Update ingredient, which also holds update ingredient as an identifier here. And then also another constant, delete ingredient, which holds delete ingredient as an identifier here. As we learned, we also need classes because an action is actually an object based on such a class and not just a string identifier. So I'll export a class here, update ingredient, which will implement action and which therefore needs that read-only type that should be update ingredient here. And for updating an ingredient, we also need some data. So let's add a constructor, and the constructor here will get a payload again. And the payload here will actually be an object. So it's of type object, but not an empty object, but instead an object with two pieces of information. And we find these two pieces in the existing shopping list service. It's the index of the element which we want to update and the new ingredient. So therefore, here we expect to get the index, which should be a number, and the ingredient, which should be of type ingredient. Now that's one of the two classes we need. Deleting an ingredient is also an action. So let's also export the class delete ingredient here. That also implements action, therefore also has the read-only type, which is equal to delete ingredient. And we also need a constructor here because we require some data. And the data here, the payload, is simply a number because if we have a look at that shopping list service again, the information we need for deleting an ingredient is simply the index, which is a number. And therefore, the payload here will be the index of the thing we want to delete, so of the ingredient we want to delete, and therefore this is also just a number. Now we should add these actions here to our union type down there. So add update ingredient and add delete ingredient like this. Restructure this a bit to make it easier to read, written beneath each other. And with that, the shopping list actions file is prepared. But of course, the shopping list actions file is only one of the things we need. We also need to work on the reducer. We need to add logic there to update an ingredient and, unsurprisingly, to delete an ingredient.